She saved lives for 30 years, then got arrested trying to pick up her own prescription. What began in a quiet pharmacy turned into a national reckoning. One woman's calm defiance would bring an entire police department to its knees. You won't believe how it ends. Friday, 9:17 p.m. The pale yellow neon sign of Milltown Pharmacy reflected off the windshield, casting a dull glow across the weary face of Naomi Brooks, 55, head nurse at Allen Creek Medical Center. She had just wrapped up a grueling 16-hour shift. Her back ached, her eyes burned, and every step felt like walking on hot coals. But despite the exhaustion, Naomi steered her old sedan into the familiar parking lot. She needed to pick up her blood pressure medication before heading home. The summer air in Ohio still hung heavy with humidity, even though the sky had long faded into darkness. The lone street lamp outside the pharmacy flickered, as if it too was trying to hold on after a long day. Naomi stepped out of the car, slinging her plain handbag over one shoulder, and walked in. The glass door clicked open with a soft chime. Inside, the pharmacy was nearly empty. A young male clerk, half yawning while scrolling on his phone behind the counter, barely looked up. Naomi offered a polite smile and gently laid her insurance card, prescription, and driver's license on the counter. The clerk glanced at them and began typing, detached, like she was just another part of a monotonous night shift routine. Naomi waited patiently, clutching an old pill organizer, her eyes drifting toward the nearly deserted parking lot. She'd done this job for over 30 years, tending to patients, staying up through the night beside the dying, stitching wounds both physical and emotional. But now, standing in a pharmacy she'd visited countless times, she felt invisible. The clerk furrowed his brows at the screen and whispered something to the middle-aged woman behind him. The woman, probably a new night shift manager with a tight ponytail and a pinched expression, glanced at Naomi, then back at the monitor. Her voice dropped, cold and sharp. "I think there's an issue with this file." Naomi frowned. "I pick up my prescription here every month. All my paperwork is in order. I can't speak for what's happened before. There could be a discrepancy. We need to verify," the manager replied, already discreetly pressing a call button beneath the counter. Naomi straightened, her voice calm, steady, like when handling a medical emergency. "I have proper ID, insurance, and a valid prescription. I don't understand why you need to call the police. We're just following protocol, ma'am." No one yelled. No one raised their voice. But the air in the room dropped a few degrees. Naomi felt it instantly. That familiar shift, not born of reason, but of race. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was suspicion by default. When the distant wail of sirens pierced the night, Naomi didn't flinch. She stood still, hands clenching the straps of her handbag. Tonight, she hadn't come just to collect medication. She was stepping into a confrontation she hadn't chosen. But this time, she wasn't backing down. The bell above the door chimed again as two officers stepped into Milltown Pharmacy. Both were white, clad in navy blue uniforms, nameplates gleaming beneath the fluorescent lights. Leading was Lieutenant Brian Sutter, Allen Creek's police chief, tall and broad, his hair buzz short, eyes razor sharp. Beside him was Officer Lena Tate, younger and slighter, her gaze flickering away like she was holding back words she couldn't say. Pharmacy manager Cheryl Whitman nearly rushed toward them, her voice low but urgent. "That's her, Naomi Brooks. She claims this prescription is hers, but the information doesn't match. I suspect she's committing insurance fraud." There were no questions, no request to review documents. Lieutenant Sutter walked straight toward Naomi, his gaze more condemning than any. "We reserve the right to refuse service sign ever hung on a wall. Ma'am, stand up. Show me your ID. Now." Naomi remained seated in the waiting chair. She looked up, not with fear, but with a heavy, weary calm. "I already gave my documents to the young man at the counter. I haven't done anything wrong." Brian didn't listen, or pretended not to. "I won't repeat myself." Naomi slowly reached into her wallet and pulled out her insurance card, driver's license, and the doctor-signed prescription. Brian gave him a cursory glance, then jerked his head toward Lena. "Take her outside. We'll deal with this at the station." Naomi stood. She didn't shout. She didn't resist. but her shoulders tensed, and her gaze drifted, not to them, but to that distant space where every injustice she'd endured in 55 years as a mother, a nurse, a black woman in a still wounded nation had collected. Nearby, a customer, a college student named Mateo, quietly hit record on his phone as Naomi was led away. No one spoke, but no one looked away either. Brian cuffed her before they reached the door. Cold steel clicked around her wrists, the sound sealing off what little dignity she had left in the eyes of the room. Naomi didn't fight. She only said one thing, barely above a whisper, but loud enough to silence the entire pharmacy. "I'm a nurse. I've held a hand to the dying, and now you're treating me like a criminal." No one responded, but Lena Tate's face, as she closed the squad car door and her tear-brimmed eyes avoiding Naomi in the rearview mirror, said what words couldn't. Naomi knew one thing for certain. The truth had not been checked, and justice, as always, was arriving late. The patrol car door slammed shut behind her. The click echoed like a period on a sentence that had stolen her dignity. Her hands were bound behind her, wrists aching from the too tight cuffs. The dark blue nurse's blouse she still wore, stained with dried blood from her last emergency shift, was now soaked with sweat and humiliation. Up front, Officer Brian Sutter was still ranting about the pattern of insurance abuse in the community, his words slicing through the suffocating silence of the vehicle like blades. Lena Tate said nothing. She stared out the window, jaw clenched, but Naomi saw the way her hand gripped the edge of the passenger seat, tight, trembling. As the cruiser passed through downtown Allen Creek, amber streetlights cast a harsh glow across Naomi's face, illuminating the deep lines etched around her eyes. Not from age, but from years of endurance. A couple exiting the movie theater paused when they saw her in handcuffs. The husband raised his phone to take a picture, but his wife gently touched his arm and shook her head. "Don't get involved." And so they walked away. Another silence, another missed moment. When they arrived at the police station, Naomi was pulled from the car without the cuffs being removed. Brian handled her as though she were a flight risk, treating her like someone dangerous instead of a nurse fresh off a 16-hour shift. As they entered the main lobby, a few night shift officers stood up, eyebrows raised. One of them, a tall, older black man, Sergeant Theodore Johnson, frowned. "What's this?" Brian smirked. "Insurance fraud case. Caught in the act." Johnson looked Naomi up and down, eyes landing on her nurse's uniform. "With cuffs." Brian shrugged, signaling that it wasn't a big deal. Lena stood motionless, like a statue made of guilt. Naomi still hadn't said a word, but her eyes were changing. No longer the gaze of someone bearing quiet humiliation. Now, it was the gaze of someone who knew this wasn't just a personal insult. It was part of a pattern, a chain that had been forged long before her, handed down generation to generation. Too familiar to be surprising anymore. Then something unexpected happened. A boy, maybe 12 years old, sitting in the waiting area beside his mother, a patient just brought in from the ER, suddenly recognized her. He pointed. "Mom, that's the nurse who helped me last week. Remember? She held my hand while the doctor stitched me up." His mother looked up, then nodded slowly. "Yes, that's her. The nurse who helped you stay brave." The whole room fell silent. Brian turned around, ready to respond, but Johnson stepped in front of him. "Take off the cuffs. Now." Brian raised an eyebrow, defensive. "We haven't confirmed identity." "I know exactly who she is," Johnson cut in, voice sharp and authoritative. "This is Naomi Brooks, one of the most dedicated nurses at Allen Creek Medical Center." A pause settled over the room. Then Johnson turned to Naomi, his eyes now full of quiet respect. "I'm sorry, Naomi. This isn't going to end here." Naomi gave a subtle nod. No tears, no trembling, just the silence of a storm gathering strength. The holding cell at Allen Creek Regional wasn't much more than a repurposed storage room, lit all night by flickering fluorescent lights. Naomi Brooks sat upright on a frigid metal bench, hands resting calmly on her lap, eyes fixed on the closed steel door. The silence in the room didn't bring peace. It was suffocating. The kind of quiet that suggested everything good in the world had been locked out. She didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't call for anyone. Instead, Naomi quietly sifted the memories that made her who she was. A 55-year-old woman who had survived 3 near-death surgeries to save patients, who had held her mother's hand for 12 straight hours as she passed, who had braved winter nights without enough gas money just to clock into the hospital on time. All those nights of endurance hadn't broken her, and tonight wouldn't either. But there was one thing Naomi didn't know. On the other side of town, inside a brick house tucked along Quiet Street, her father, Franklin Brooks, had begun moving like a quiet storm. A retired federal agent, 79 years old, but still sharp as a blade pulled from an intelligence dossier. When he got the call from an old friend in the DOJ, Sergeant Theodore Johnson, the cold in his voice could have frozen steel. She was arrested? Franklin repeated, each word landing with the weight of forged iron. For picking up prescription? Within minutes, he had slipped into his press suit, buttoned his coat, and opened a safe to retrieve a warm manila file stamped in bold. Allen Creek PD, unresolved internal reports. When he started the engine of his old Ford Crown Victoria, the car rumbled to life like a memory waking from slumber. Every street sign, every alley, every name he'd once investigated returned to him, vivid and unfinished. Back at the station, the night desk sergeant answered an unlisted internal line with a puzzled expression. Who is this? The voice on the other end came flat and unmistakable. My name is Franklin Brooks. I'll be there in 30 minutes. And I sincerely hope you have a damn good reason for why a nurse, no priors, no record, is being held illegally. The sergeant set the phone down slowly, color draining from his face like a man who just heard the ticking of a countdown. Naomi closed her eyes, not in fear, but from a tremble of something warmer. Hope. Someone was coming, not to rescue her like a victim, but to make the system flinch at the mention of her name. The doorbell at the Allen Creek Police Department rang once, then twice. By the third time, no one dared ignore it. Franklin Brooks stepped through the threshold with a steady gait that commanded attention, like the man auditing the entire precinct. 79 years old, silver-haired, trench coat weighed down by the misty night rain, and eyes that had stared down deceit from New York to Bogota. He didn't come alone. Behind him were 2 federal agents, gray suits, earpieces glinting, expressions as cold as stone. The shift supervisor looked up from his desk, but his eyes barely had a second to meet Franklin's before the old man dropped a worn leather wallet onto the counter. An FBI badge slid halfway out, catching the fluorescent light and gleaming with 5 words that made more than a few in Ohio wish they'd never have to see it again. Special Agent read, Franklin R. Brooks. I'm here for my daughter, Naomi Brooks, nurse, 55, detained by your officers without warrant, without cause. And I want to speak to the person who authorized it now. No one answered. Someone better start talking, Franklin said, his voice sharp as a snap wire, eyes locked on the security camera above. Because I just recorded my entire call with the DOJ Civil Rights Division, and I don't repeat myself. The air in the station dropped 10 degrees. A young officer rushed in, followed closely by Officer Lena Tate. Moments later, Police Chief Brian Sutter appeared. But before he could speak, Franklin raised a single finger. No, Brian, I'll talk. You will listen. Franklin turned to the 2 federal agents standing behind him. One stepped forward and produced a summons, signed by a federal judge, demanding the department's internal records. The other pulled out a tablet and pressed play on surveillance footage from the Milltown pharmacy. On screen, Naomi Brooks in her nurse's scrubs, standing still with her hands cupped behind her back, a pair of steel restraints cutting into her wrists, and her gaze steady enough to silence a room full of gunfire. This conduct is under review as a potential violation of Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code, the agent declared, his voice echoing through the station like a gavel in a courtroom. Unlawful detainment, violation of civil rights, excessive force used against a nonviolent civilian, silence slammed down like a steel trap. Franklin Brooks stepped forward, eyes locked on Lieutenant Brian Sutter, the man who had ordered his daughter cuffed without a second thought. His voice was gravelly and low, but every syllable landed like a dropped anvil. I once took down a crooked police racket in Texas in '89 with a single fax machine. You think I don't know how to make this whole station tremble? A breathless pause. Lieutenant Sutter, so smug just hours ago, stood frozen. His throat bobbed, but no sound came out. His face went from flush to pale in the span of a heartbeat. Behind him, young Officer Lena Tate avoided Franklin's eyes, clutching the brim of her hat, like a student caught cheating during finals. The chief inspector of the department, a balding man with a weathered badge glinting under the lights, had no choice but to step forward. His face looked molded from hardened clay. He cleared his throat, then turned to the desk officer. "Open a holding cell," he ordered, voice taut with tension. "Right now." The sound of keys turning in the lock sliced through the tension like a blade. The heavy steel door creaked open. Naomi Brooks stepped out, her nurse scrubs rumpled and damp with rain. Her shoulders remained upright, but her eyes were bloodshot. She didn't cry. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, she took a long, slow breath, swallowing the humiliation whole. Franklin approached her, not with frantic relief, but with quiet gravity. He didn't embrace her. He simply placed a rough, calloused hand gently on her shoulder, light enough to comfort, firm enough to remind the room that they had just crossed the wrong man's daughter. No one in uniform spoke. Eyes dropped to the floor, feet shuffled softly, like everyone wished they could melt into the walls. Naomi turned, her gaze sweeping across the holding area, over the faces that had so coldly judged her. She left behind only silence, dense, suffocating, immovable. She walked out into the cold rain. No longer the woman humiliated at a pharmacy. Naomi Brooks was now the eye of a storm they themselves had summoned, and she moved through it with the calm of a rising tide prepared to drown a rotting fortress. By early morning, the air inside Allen Creek Police Headquarters was still heavy with unease from the night before. Then, the front door chimed. 2 federal agents strode through the entrance, carrying a search warrant bearing the crimson seal of the U.S. Department of Justice. Behind them came Franklin Brooks, his face unreadable, his eyes sharp as surgical steel. Officers nearby quickly stepped aside. No one dared to question. No one tried to stop them. "All internal data systems are to be surrendered immediately," the lead agent declared. "Servers, video footage, radio logs, everything." Lieutenant Sam Rourke, on duty that morning, tried to step forward to object, but Franklin intercepted him with a single step and a steely command. The Allen Creek Police Department is under federal investigation for civil rights violations. From this point forward, every move you make will be monitored. Call your attorney. At that moment, 3 more agents entered the back offices, equipped with mobile storage units and encryption tools. One headed straight for the security hub, unplugged the master surveillance drive, sealed it in a tamper-proof bag, and locked it in a coded case. Nearby, Officer Lena Tate sat frozen. She had witnessed Naomi's arrest. She had said nothing. Now, all she could do was lower her head, her hands trembling as an agent asked, "You were on shift last night, correct? Did you hear Lieutenant Brian Sutter instruct that woman be escorted outside?" She nodded. No words, just a nod. In the central conference room, Franklin and the lead federal agent, a black man in his early 50s wearing a DOJ badge around his neck, stood before a whiteboard outlining the internal structure of the Allen Creek Police Department. 3 names were circled in red: Lieutenant Brian Sutter, Officer Lena Tate, and Pharmacy Manager Cheryl Whitman. "I want a full audit of every prescription Cheryl Whitman has processed in the past 12 months, Franklin said. "I want to know how many black patients were denied, and how many times the police were called due to a so-called technical error in the computer system," the lead agent added. Then came a sudden breakthrough. Agent Ramirez, the digital forensic specialist, discovered a hidden folder buried deep in the department's internal server. Inside were encrypted radio transmissions, among them one brief but damning recording from the night Naomi was arrested. The voice of Lieutenant Brian Sutter rang out clearly. "We need another high-visibility case. These kind of calls help boost our quick response metrics." The room fell dead silent. Franklin clenched his fists, his eyes fixed on the replay of the recording. Without a word, He pulled out his phone and dialed a familiar number. "This is Franklin Brooks. I'm confirming this is no longer a local incident. This is a pattern of systemic abuse. Initiate federal escalation." For the first time in 40 years, the Allen Creek Police Department was placed under special federal oversight. The door of unchecked authority they had long used to silence others was now flung wide open for the world to walk in. And from that moment forward, Naomi Brooks was no longer just a mistaken suspect. She became a symbol of everything the system had feared, an ordinary woman willing to stand tall when everyone else stayed silent. 3 days after the Department of Justice intervened, daylight poured over the Allen Creek Police Department like a reminder. Truth does not stay buried forever. Federal agents had gathered enough evidence to expose the wrongdoing of those involved. A security camera video from Milltown Pharmacy was released, showing Naomi Brooks being handcuffed and escorted away without a single act of resistance. The footage spread rapidly across media outlets, igniting widespread outrage in the community. The audio clip of Lieutenant Sutter, combined with the video evidence, became irrefutable proof of racial profiling and abuse of power. The public response reached a fever pitch as a press conference was held at Allen Creek City Hall. Naomi Brooks stood beside her father, Franklin Brooks, and the federal agents, facing hundreds of journalists and community members. Her voice was steady, unwavering. "I am not the only victim, but I hope to be the last one forced to endure this kind of injustice." The outcome of the investigation led to the suspension of Lieutenant Brian Sutter, Officer Lena Tate, pharmacy manager Cheryl Whitman, and the pharmacy clerk. All four now face federal charges for civil rights violations and abuse of authority. Naomi's story became a powerful symbol in the fight against injustice and discrimination. She was invited to speak at numerous events, inspiring thousands to rise and demand their rights and dignity. Within just 48 hours of the press conference, the name Naomi Brooks was everywhere, on headlines, phone screens, and national news broadcasts. In Allen Creek, a town once buried under decades of silence and conservatism, the atmosphere had shifted into something electric, as if someone had set fire to the long-accumulated dust of indifference. What began as a small vigil in the town square soon swelled into a crowd of hundreds, then thousands. Flags, banners, and chants of justice for Naomi filled the main streets, under the warm yellow glow of antique street lamps. Families brought their children, elders leaned on canes, and students painted slogans across their t-shirts. They stood together, not just for a single victim, but for the truth. Local news station WACN 9 covered every development closely. Clips showing the misconduct of Officers Sutter and Tate played in a near-continuous loop, a silent but damning indictment. On TikTok, a video of Naomi being handcuffed, captioned, "She saved lives for 30 years. This is how they thanked her," had already surpassed 12 million views. A moment that set the crowd ablaze came when a high school student, Malik Jefferson, stepped up to the mic, his voice trembling with emotion. "Naomi Brooks cared for my grandmother during her final days. She was the only one holding her hand when we weren't allowed in the hospital during COVID. To me, she's a hero." No one could have predicted that a small town like Allen Creek would become the epicenter of a nationwide wave of protest. But this time, no one remained on the sidelines. One viral post read, "Not New York, not Los Angeles." Justice began to speak from a pharmacy in Ohio. And Naomi, the woman who once just wanted to pick up a prescription and go home, now stood at the heart of the storm, no longer alone, but as the face of a long-awaited reckoning. Naomi Brooks never imagined she'd one day stand before hundreds of the Allen Creek City Hall, a place she used to pass on her way to the hospital, as a representative plaintiff in a class action lawsuit against an entire system. From a woman quietly carrying the weight of night shifts in the emergency room, Naomi had become the embodiment of resilience and justice long denied. But to her, this wasn't about being celebrated. It was about taking on a responsibility. The first meeting of the plaintiffs was held in a small church on the south side of town. Franklin Brooks, Naomi's father, was there too, sitting quietly in the back pew. At the podium, civil rights attorney Elijah Morris spoke with measured urgency. "We are not suing just for ourselves. We are suing for those who cannot speak, for those who've lost faith in the system, and for the generations that follow." Naomi stood up, her voice low but resolute. I used to think that staying silent was the safest way to survive. But after that night in holding cell, I realized silence can kill you too, from the inside out. Every word she spoke rang like a hammer on the heart. Some wiped away tears. Others clasped each other's hands. They were no longer scattered individuals with separate wounds. They were a collective, and Naomi was their face, their voice, their awakening. From that fateful night at Milltown Pharmacy, a fire had been lit, and now it was Naomi who led it forward, not with anger, but with dignity and truth. The final verdict echoed to federal courtroom in Ohio like a bell tolling for justice long delayed. Officers Brian Sutter and Lena Tate were formally convicted of civil rights violations, abuse of power, and unlawful arrest. The Milltown Pharmacy manager was also indicted for falsification and discriminatory practices. The town of Allen Creek seemed to hold its breath as the judge read the sentences. Outside the courthouse, hundreds applauded, not out of vengeance, but because they had seen a flicker of hope. The justice system, though slow, had finally acknowledged the truth. Naomi did not appear on television. She gave no press statements. She didn't need to. What she represented had surpassed image and personal story. It had become a catalyst for change. The Allen Creek Police Department underwent a full overhaul, retraining on implicit bias, oversight from an independent panel, and for the first time in years, invitations to local residents to join a civilian review board. What was once considered impossible now became the new standard. Naomi quietly returned to her job at the hospital as if she had never left. But people looked at her differently, not because she was famous, but because she had proven something. Dignity doesn't need a shout to be heard. One late spring afternoon, she sat on the front porch with a mug of herbal tea, watching children laugh and play on the sidewalk. Franklin Brooks sat down beside her, saying nothing. They didn't need to. Naomi smiled faintly. She knew the fight wasn't over. But this time, she wasn't just a survivor of injustice. She was the one who rewrote a chapter of it. And in doing so, she became part of something larger, a future where silence is no longer mistaken for weakness, but recognized as a strength to endure until the moment is right to rise.